The church bell began ringing before dawn, not for worship, not for celebration, but for counting. By the time the sun lifted over the frost-covered fields of coastal Massachusetts, 50 children were gone. Their boots were still lined beside pews. Their slates and chalk rested neatly on benches. Half-finished catechisms lay open to passages about obedience and salvation, and yet not one of them returned home. No bodies were found, no ransom note arrived, no confession was ever written. Only a silence that would suffocate an entire colony and a record quietly buried in parish archives for more than 2 centuries. This is the story of the 50 children who vanished from Sunday school, and the men who ensured no one would ever speak of it again. In the winter of 1742, the town of Ipswich, the province of Massachusetts Bay, was a place suspended between fear and faith. Colonial New England was not merely religious. It was governed by religion. Though the infamous Salem trials had ended nearly half a century earlier, their shadow lingered. The Congregational Church was not just a house of worship, it was the moral spine of society. Attendance was mandatory. Dissent could result in fines, imprisonment, or social exile. Sunday school, though informal by modern standards, had become an extension of this rigid spiritual structure. Children were taught scripture, discipline, and submission. They memorized passages from the Geneva Bible and recited lessons on original sin and divine order. The belief was simple: a disciplined child preserved a godly colony. Ipswich was prosperous by colonial standards. Fishing vessels moved between its harbor and Boston. Timber and salted cod sustained its economy. Yet beneath this surface stability, tension simmered. The 1740s marked the height of the First Great Awakening, a sweeping religious revival that fractured congregations throughout the colonies. Charismatic preachers challenged established ministers, preaching emotional salvation over rigid doctrine. Some called it renewal, others called it chaos. Families argued in kitchens, congregations split. Ministers warned of heresies spreading like disease. And in Ipswich, that warning took on a darker meaning. On the morning of February 14, 1742, 50 children between the ages of 6 and 13 gathered at the Old South meetinghouse on High Street. The structure itself was stark and severe: whitewashed timber, narrow windows, no ornamentation. The Puritan distrust of beauty was visible in every beam. Inside, the children sat in orderly rows beneath the watchful eyes of Deacon Samuel Whitford, a man respected for his discipline and feared for his severity. Whitford was a pillar of Ipswich society, a landowner, a magistrate's confidant, a man whose sermons were said to strip vanity from the soul. He believed in structure, in obedience, in correction. He also believed children were born corrupt. Whitford had recently spoken against the emotional revivalism sweeping Massachusetts. He warned that enthusiasm, what others called spiritual passion, was dangerous, disorderly, even satanic. To him, salvation was quiet, controlled, unquestioning. That Sunday morning, the lesson was taken from the book of Proverbs: spare the rod, spoil the child. Witnesses later recalled that Whitford dismissed parents unusually early, told them the children would remain for additional instruction. That was the last time many parents saw their sons and daughters alive. When the first mother returned near midday, concerned that her youngest had not come home, she found the meetinghouse locked. The windows were shuttered from within. No smoke rose from the hearth. No sound stirred inside. Within an hour, word spread through Ipswich like wildfire through dry brush. Fathers gathered with tools and muskets. The meetinghouse door was forced open. What they found was not violence, it was absence. Benches neatly aligned, Bibles stacked. 50 small cloaks hung on pegs by the entrance, but no children. And no Deacon Whitford. Tracks in the snow suggested movement toward the wooded marshlands near the Ipswich River, yet the snowfall the night before had been heavy enough to obscure anything more than vague impressions. Search parties combed the frozen terrain for 3 days. They found nothing. No broken branches, no disturbed earth, no footprints beyond what they themselves created. It was as if the children had dissolved into the New England air. Colonial law enforcement was rudimentary. There were no centralized police forces. Authority rested with local magistrates and constables, Men often tied closely to the church. An inquiry was announced, but it was not conducted publicly. Records showed that Magistrate Jonathan Hale, a close associate of Whitford, convened a private council of church elders rather than a civil trial. The disappearance was framed not as a crime, but as a spiritual crisis. Rumors spread quietly through Ipswich and neighboring towns. Some whispered of kidnapping by native tribes, though no evidence supported it, and local Wampanoag leaders denied any involvement. Others blamed itinerant revivalist preachers, accusing them of radical influence or secret gatherings. But a smaller, more fearful group suspected something else. They suspected the church itself. One man refused to accept silence as explanation. His name was Thomas Avery. Avery was not a preacher, nor a magistrate. He was a cooper, a barrel maker, known for careful hands and sharper eyes. His daughter, Eliza, aged 8, had been among the missing. Unlike many in Ipswich, Avery had grown skeptical of Whitford's harsh doctrine. He attended revival meetings in neighboring towns, drawn to sermons that spoke of mercy rather than punishment. When the council announced that Deacon Whitford had withdrawn from public view for reasons of health, Avery knew something was wrong. Withdrawn? 50 children were missing, and the man last seen with them had simply withdrawn? Avery began asking questions the council did not want answered. He visited nearby settlements, examined ferry logs along the Ipswich River. He spoke, quietly to servants and laborers who had been near the meetinghouse that morning. One farmhand reported hearing wagon wheels before dawn the following day, heading south, not toward Boston, but toward the coastal cliffs. Another recalled seeing Whitford speaking urgently with Magistrate Hale 2 nights prior. The pieces did not form a picture yet, but they suggested coordination. Colonial Massachusetts in the 1740s was deeply hierarchical. Social mobility was limited. Church leadership overlapped with political authority. To accuse a deacon was to challenge the foundation of civic order. Avery was warned to stop, privately, firmly. He was told grief clouded his judgment. He was told Satan exploited sorrow. He was told obedience was the Christian path. But Avery persisted, because 50 children do not vanish without design. And silence, he believed, was complicity. Weeks passed. Winter tightened its grip. The official narrative shifted subtly, from disappearance to divine mystery. The council suggested that perhaps God had claimed the innocent to spare them corruption. A day of fasting and prayer was declared. No mention of Whitford's whereabouts was made again. Then something happened that the council could not control. A ledger surfaced, not in Ipswich, but in Boston. Shipping record dated February 16, 1742, listed an unusual cargo loaded onto a private vessel, departing from Gloucester Harbor, less than 20 miles from Ipswich. The cargo was described only as indentured apprentices, 50 no names, no ages, no origin specified. The vessel's destination? Barbados, in the British West Indies. Indentured servitude was legal in colonial America. Children could be apprenticed, especially orphans or the impoverished, but it required documentation, parental consent, contracts. No such contracts existed for the children of Ipswich, and Barbados, by the 1740s, was notorious. Sugar plantations operated on brutal labor systems dominated by enslaved Africans. Mortality rates were staggering. White indentured servants, especially children, often perished within years due to disease and exhaustion. The idea that 50 New England children had been shipped there under false pretenses was unthinkable, unless someone powerful had authorized it. Avery traveled to Boston himself. He obtained a copy of the shipping ledger through a sympathetic clerk. The captain's name was Elias Morton. Morton had long-standing business ties to Magistrate Hale, and Hale had authorized export permits that same week. Suddenly, the silence in Ipswich felt less like confusion, and more like orchestration. When Avery returned to confront the council, he was not met with debate. He was arrested, charged with sedition, accused of spreading dangerous falsehoods that threatened colonial stability. The trial held quietly, concluded swiftly. Avery was fined and publicly reprimanded. His business license was temporarily suspended. The message was unmistakable: obedience or exile. What happened to Deacon Samuel Whitford remains officially undocumented. Some records suggest he relocated to Connecticut under a different parish appointment. Others imply he sailed for England shortly after the disappearance. No formal charges were ever filed. No public acknowledgement was made linking the missing children to the Barbados vessel. The ledger entry was later amended, the line reading indentured apprentices, 50 scratched faintly, as if someone had attempted erasure, but not completely.
Oh.
Because history, no matter how deeply buried, leaves marks. In the decades that followed, Ipswich grew. New churches were built. New children filled Sunday pews, and the story of the 50 faded into whispers. Parents were told to let go, to trust divine will, to avoid stirring past wounds. But Thomas Avery never stopped believing the truth had been stolen, just like his daughter. And in the margins of colonial record books, in faded ink, in overlooked shipping logs, fragments of that truth remain. This was not a supernatural disappearance. It was not divine intervention. It was structure. It was authority. It was faith weaponized under the protection of law. It was only the beginning. As the deeper we examine the intersection of religion and colonial commerce, the more unsettling the connections become. Who truly benefited from those children vanishing? Why were church elders so quick to suppress investigation? And how many other towns buried similar stories beneath sermons and scripture? You're watching Liturgy of Darkness, where we uncover the hidden sins buried beneath history's sacred walls. If this story unsettled you, that's because it should. Like this video to help us expose forgotten truths. Comment below. Do you believe this was a calculated act of profit, or something even more disturbing hidden within the church hierarchy? Share this with someone who believes history is always righteous. Because in part 2, we follow the money. We examine the Barbados plantation records. We uncover the financial ties between Massachusetts clergy and West Indian sugar estates. And we reveal what may have happened to the 50 children who never came home. The deeper we go, the darker it becomes. This is only the beginning. When Thomas Avery stepped out of the Ipswich jail in the spring of 1742, the air felt thinner than he remembered, not because winter had passed, because something invisible had shifted. In colonial Massachusetts, punishment did not always require chains. A public reprimand from the church could fracture a man's livelihood faster than any prison term. Customers avoided Avery's cooperage. Merchants who once extended credit now demanded payment in coin. Neighbors did not speak against him, but neither did they meet his eyes. The social architecture of New England was as rigid as its timber frames. Town life revolved around the meetinghouse, served as sanctuary, courthouse, voting hall, and moral tribunal. Sermons governed behavior as surely as statutes enacted by the General Court in Boston. And the General Court, though technically separate from the clergy, was deeply entangled with it. Ministers influenced magistrates. Magistrates enforced ecclesiastical discipline. The line between spiritual guidance and civil authority was nearly invisible. To challenge one was to challenge both. Avery now understood this intimately, but grief is a relentless tutor. He returned to his workshop, shaping barrel staves by hand, the scent of oak and iron hoops grounding him in routine. Ipswich's economy depended on trade. Salted cod shipped to the Caribbean, timber floated downriver, molasses imported north. Barrels were currency containers of empire. An empire, Avery was beginning to suspect, had swallowed his daughter. The province of Massachusetts Bay in the 1740s was not isolated piety. It was part of a global network. Ships moved constantly between Boston, Salem, Gloucester, and British colonies in the West Indies. Sugar, rum, and enslaved labor fueled profits. Though New England's climate did not favor plantation agriculture, its merchants financed it, its vessels transported it. Many clergy publicly condemned the moral dangers of Caribbean indulgence. Privately, some invested in it. Avery learned this from a man named Caleb Fitch, a Boston dock clerk who had quietly assisted him weeks earlier. Fitch was young, educated at Harvard College, and disillusioned with what he called sanctified arithmetic. They met in the shadow of Boston's Long Wharf, where tall-masted ships creaked against wooden piers.
Oh.
The harbor smelled of brine and molasses. Laborers shouted in accents from England, Ireland, and Africa. Fitch brought papers, not official documents. Copies, shipping manifests, insurance contracts, partnership agreements between Boston merchants and sugar estate owners in Barbados. One name appeared repeatedly in the margins of those agreements: Jonathan Hale, the same magistrate who had chaired the private council in Ipswich, the same man who dismissed public inquiry into the vanished children. Hale's investments were discreet, funneled through intermediaries. But the paper trail was undeniable. He held a financial stake in 2 plantations outside Bridgetown. One of them had recently expanded its labor force. Indentured juveniles, the estate's accounting book described them. No names listed, it's just numbers. 50. The discovery should have felt like vindication. Instead, it hollowed Avery further, because proof meant intent, and intent meant design. But how could a deacon and a magistrate coordinate the removal of 50 children from a New England town without resistance? The answer lay in structure. Colonial towns were governed by covenant theology, the belief that the community's survival depended on collective obedience to God's law. Individual suffering was secondary to communal order. If leadership framed an event as divine will, dissent became rebellion, not just against authority, but against providence itself. Whitford understood this. Before his disappearance, he had preached a series of sermons on purification, on removing corruption before it spread. He spoke of Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac, of obedience above attachment. Some parishioners had felt unease at the time, but unease in Ipswich was swallowed by doctrine. Avery began revisiting the Old South meetinghouse under the pretense of prayer. The building's interior was austere: box pews, high pulpit, narrow gallery for singers. As the architecture reflected Puritan theology, no stained glass, no statues, nothing to distract from Scripture. Yet something felt altered. Behind the pulpit, where the deacon's chair once stood, the wooden flooring bore faint marks, scuffs inconsistent with ordinary foot traffic. And beneath one plank, slightly warped, he noticed iron nail heads that were newer than the surrounding timber. Avery was a craftsman, who spoke to him. One evening, after twilight prayer concluded and the sexton extinguished candles, Avery remained behind. He waited until the building emptied completely, then he pried. Beneath the plank was not a cellar, but a narrow compartment. Inside lay folded parchments sealed with wax, letters not addressed to parishioners, addressed to Captain Elias Morton, the same captain listed on the Gloucester shipping manifest. The letters were coded in phrasing but clear in implication. 50 lambs prepared for distant tending, purification complete prior to thaw, ensure quiet transfer before congregation inquiry. They were signed only with initials S.W. Samuel Whitford. The compartment also contained architectural sketches, not of the meetinghouse, but of a warehouse near Gloucester Harbor. The drawings indicated concealed holding areas partitioned within storage rooms. Ventilation slats disguised behind stacked crates. Temporary, discreet, designed to avoid detection. Avery's hands trembled not from fear but from the realization that the meetinghouse itself had functioned as a staging ground. The children had not vanished into wilderness. They had been hidden in plain sight. But how? Ipswich was a small town. 50 children could not be moved unnoticed, unless they were moved at night or drugged. Among the letters was a receipt from a Boston apothecary for laudanum, tincture of opium commonly prescribed for pain and restlessness. The quantity purchased was significant, enough to sedate dozens. Avery imagined it. Children instructed to remain for extended scripture study, a bitter liquid administered under guise of tonic, drowsiness mistaken for fatigue, then wagons under cover of darkness, not chaotic, organized. As Avery pieced together this reconstruction, his internal struggle deepened. He had been raised within this faith, baptized beneath its roof, married under its covenant. His daughter's name was written in its registry. To expose its leaders meant fracturing the very structure that gave his life coherence. Was justice worth communal collapse? Could truth exist without destroying what remained? He wrestled with Scripture nightly, with anger, doubt. In moments of exhaustion, he wondered whether silence might indeed be mercy. But then he remembered Eliza's small hands gripping his thumb, and mercy felt indistinguishable from surrender. Meanwhile, the broader political landscape shifted. The War of Jenkins' Ear, Britain's conflict with Spain, intensified transatlantic shipping demands. Caribbean sugar production expanded to fund imperial ambitions. Colonial merchants profited from provisioning British fleets. In Boston, sermons began subtly reframing West Indian commerce as patriotic contribution. Profit became providence. Hale, now more visible in provincial politics, advocated for economic strengthening of Massachusetts through strategic colonial partnership. He spoke eloquently, convincingly. No mention of Ipswich. Whitford, according to sparse correspondence, had indeed relocated this time to a parish in Connecticut, aligned with conservative anti-revivalist factions. His sermons reportedly continued emphasizing discipline and order. The system protected its own. Avery shared the letters with Caleb Fitch. Fitch's reaction was not shock, it was calculation. "If you present this alone," he said, "they will say grief forged it, or that you stole and altered documents. So what do you propose?" Avery asked. Leverage. Fitch believed public exposure required more than moral outrage. It required political friction. The First Great Awakening had already fractured congregations. Revivalist ministers like George Whitefield drew massive crowds, challenging established clergy. Though Avery had never met Whitefield, he understood the power of dissenting pulpits. If the disappearance could be framed not as isolated corruption, but as evidence of systemic abuse within established congregational leadership, revivalist factions might seize upon it. Religious tension could become investigative pressure. But that path risked turning 50 children into rhetorical ammunition. Avery hesitated. He did not want spectacle. He wanted truth. Days later, another discovery altered his calculation. Fitch obtained plantation inventory records from Bridgetown, dated late March 1742. The entry listed juvenile servants. 47, not 50. 3 were missing from the count. Beside the number, a notation. 3, unsuitable, disposed upon arrival. Disposed. The word was clinical, efficient, terrifying. Avery stared at the ink until it blurred. Unsuitable for what? Labor? Obedience? Health? The implication was unbearable. But beneath that entry was something else. It's a marginal note referencing additional shipment pending from Northern Parish. Additional shipment. This was not singular. It was scalable. Avery returned once more to the meetinghouse, this time not to pry, but to listen. He attended service as Hale himself delivered a guest address in Whitford's absence. Hale spoke of sacrifice for communal prosperity, of placing trust in ordained leadership, of resisting voices that sowed discord through accusation. His gaze scanned the congregation deliberately. When it passed over Avery, it did not falter. There was no fear in it, only assurance. Because Hale knew what Avery now fully understood. The machinery was larger than Ipswich, larger than Whitford. The church provided moral framing. The courts provided legal cover. Commerce provided motive. An empire provided demand. After the service, as congregants dispersed, Avery noticed something subtle near the back gallery. A carved symbol he had never seen before, not religious, geometric. 3 interlocking circles intersecting at a central point. He had seen a similar marking in the corner of the plantation ledger Fitch showed him. A merchant's mark, a partnership seal. The same symbol appeared faintly embossed on one of the coded letters found beneath the pulpit. It was not Whitford acting alone. It was a network, merchants, magistrates, clergy, bound by profit disguised as providence. That night, Fitch arrived breathless at Avery's workshop. "There's more," he said. From his satchel, he withdrew a document recently acquired from a retiring customs official. It was a proposal unsigned, but unmistakably drafted by someone with legal training. The document outlined a model for moral apprenticeship exportation, arguing that impoverished or spiritually at risk colonial youth could be relocated to productive environments within His Majesty's territories, thereby strengthening both soul and empire. It cited scripture, it cited economic necessity, it cited social order. And in the margin, written in the same hand as Hale's investment letters, were the words, "Ipswich trial successful." Trial. The 50 children were a test, proof of concept. Avery felt the world tilt. This was no desperate act by a rogue deacon. It was policy in embryo. If unchallenged, it would expand. The weight of the era pressed in around him. Rigid pews, salt-streaked docks, ledger books, balancing souls against sugar. 50 children were not an accident. They were precedent. Now Avery faced a choice that would determine not only his daughter's memory, but the fate of other towns. Expose the network publicly and risk being silenced permanently, or remain quiet and watch the machinery continue. He folded the proposal carefully. For the first time since February, his grief sharpened into something else. Resolve. Because this discovery changed everything. It proved intent, proved scale, it proved that Ipswich was only the beginning. Fog pressed against the meetinghouse walls like a held breath. For a long moment, neither Thomas Avery nor Magistrate Jonathan Hale spoke. Behind them, faint lantern light flickered beneath the door, illuminating stacked crates and parchment contracts waiting for signatures. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and fell silent. It was the kind of stillness that does not belong to nature. It belongs to decision, to the space between accusation and consequence, like the pause before a judge delivers sentence, like the final inhale before a match is struck. This was the interval. The protagonist, Thomas Avery. Thomas Avery had not been born a rebel. He was the son of a cooper before him, raised among oak staves and iron hoops in Ipswich's working quarter. His father believed in order, in punctuality, in the predictable rhythm of tides and trade. The church was not questioned, it was attended. Magistrates were respected. Sermons were absorbed. Avery inherited that structure. He married Miriam at 23, under the vaulted austerity of the Old South meetinghouse. He baptized his daughter Eliza at the same pulpit beneath which he would later discover coded letters. His hands built containers for a colonial economy he never thought to examine. His weakness had once been trust. Trusted hierarchy. Trusted the covenant. Trusted that those in authority feared God more than profit. The disappearance of his daughter shattered that trust, but not immediately. At first he wanted to believe the council's language of divine mystery. Grief tempts surrender. It whispers that explanation is less important than survival. But Avery's strength lay not in defiance, it lay in endurance. He was methodical, patient, a craftsman who understood that wood must be shaped slowly, or it splits. He applied the same principle to truth. He gathered documents instead of shouting accusations. He watched instead of charging forward, yet his moral conflict deepened with each discovery. Because exposing Hale meant dismantling pillars of society. If the church fell under suspicion, what replaced it? Revivalist fervor? Mob judgment? Imperial crackdown? Avery feared chaos almost as much as he feared corruption. He feared something else. That his pursuit of justice was no longer solely about Eliza. That vengeance had intertwined with righteousness. Standing in fog before Hale, Avery confronted that fear directly. Was he driven by principle, or by the need to wound those who wounded him? He did not yet know. But he knew he could no longer return to ignorance. The antagonist, Magistrate Jonathan Hale. Jonathan Hale was not a monster in his own mind. He was a guardian. Born into modest means in Salem, Hale had risen through education and calculated alliances. He studied law in Boston, apprenticed under a provincial clerk, and learned early that power belonged to those who controlled narrative. He did not preach from pulpits, but he understood sermons better than many ministers. Religion, to Hale, was architecture. It held society upright, society fragile, coastal, threatened by war with Spain and shifting imperial policy required reinforcement. The 1740s were unstable years. First Great Awakening fractured congregations. Preachers like George Whitefield stirred emotional fervor that unsettled established authority. Farmers questioned ministers, servants questioned masters. To Hale, this was not revival, it was erosion. Empire depended on order. Order depended on discipline, and discipline required sacrifice. He viewed the Caribbean not as moral stain, but economic necessity. Sugar profits stabilized British holdings. New England's merchants thrived because plantations thrived. If impoverished colonial children could be redirected toward labor under contracts framed as spiritual apprenticeship, then both colony and empire strengthened. In Hale's philosophy, morality was measured by outcome. 50 children endured hardship, but ensured prosperity for thousands. Was that not divine arithmetic? He believed so. And he justified his actions through covenant theology, the idea that communal survival superseded individual suffering. Whitford had been an instrument. Morton, the captain, a facilitator, Briggs and Rowley, a partner in expansion. Holly was the architect, not cruel, calculated. He did not see himself as trafficker. He saw himself as steward of a fragile order. And that belief made him far more dangerous than a villain motivated by greed alone. Because Hale did not act for gold, he acted for stability. Or so he told himself. The supporting players' loyalty and fear. Reverend Samuel Whitford, now absent from Ipswich, represented doctrinal rigidity. He genuinely believed children were born sinful and required severe shaping. When Hale presented the apprenticeship model as spiritual refinement combined with economic benefit, Whitford saw providence. His loyalty was theological. He feared revivalist chaos more than distant suffering. Captain Elias Morton, master of the Gloucester vessel, operated on thinner conviction. His loyalty was financial. Mortgages on his ship, debts owed in Boston. He transported cargo without moral examination, yet he avoided details deliberately, a subtle cowardice disguised as pragmatism. Reverend Nathaniel Briggs and Rowley wavered. Like Whitford, Briggs was not entirely convinced. He feared Hale's influence, but also feared isolation. If he refused partnership, funding for his parish might evaporate. His sermons on obedience masked private hesitation. Then there was Caleb Fitch. Young, educated, caught between ambition and conscience. Fitch admired the law, but recoiled at its manipulation. His loyalty leaned toward Avery, but fear stalked him. If exposed, he would lose position, perhaps freedom. Even Miriam Avery lived within that tension. Her loyalty was absolute, her fear constant. She understood that if Thomas failed, she would face consequences alone. Each supporting figure embodied the colonial dilemma, survival within hierarchy versus resistance to it. And none were entirely innocent, because silence, too, sustained systems. The interval words unspoken. "You have traveled far from home," Hale said quietly, his hand lifting from Avery's shoulder. The fog muted the edges of his voice. "I go where truth leads," Avery replied. Hal studied him with clinical curiosity. "You mistake disruption for truth." Behind them, a crate shifted as someone inside the meetinghouse adjusted its position. Neither man turned. This was not yet public. This was a negotiation. "The parish north of here prepares contracts," Avery said evenly. "Contracts for children, apprenticeships," Hale corrected. "Lawful, sanctioned, signed under pressure, signed under guidance." The distinction hovered between them. Hall stepped slightly closer, lowering his voice further. "You believe you are protecting children? I am protecting a colony, by sending them to die." Hale did not flinch. Mortality exists everywhere. In Ipswich winters, on fishing decks, in childbirth. Barbados is not unique. Avery felt anger surge, but he restrained it, because this was the interval. Emotion would fracture leverage. "You tested this in Ipswich," Avery said softly. "You called it a trial." Hale's expression did not shift. "You read what was not meant for you? 50 children? 47 survived the crossing. The number fell like iron." Hale did not deny it. He reframed it. "Those children," Hale continued, "were sons and daughters of poverty. Futures constrained by land scarcity and unrest. In Barbados, they labor, yes, but they also contribute. They become assets." "Assets," Avery echoed. "To empire, to order. And if parents refuse..." Hale's pause was almost imperceptible. Persuasion can be arranged. There it was, not abduction. But coercion sanctified by authority. The revelation. Hale reached into his coat and withdrew a folded parchment. He handed it to Avery. Not defensively. Deliberately. Avery unfolded it under dim, fog-filtered light. It was a copy of Ipswich's church covenant, but amended. At the bottom, beneath original signatures, new clauses appeared in careful script. "In times of communal necessity, youth may be redirected for the strengthening of His Majesty's dominion under ecclesiastical discernment. Signed. By Whitford." By Hale, and by 2 Ipswich selectmen Avery had considered allies. Dated 1 week before the February disappearance. They had not acted secretly alone. They had secured legal adaptation first. Backdated, perhaps, but documented. Holly observed Avery absorbing the implications. "This is not rogue action," Holly said calmly. It is sanctioned evolution. The power shift was subtle but profound. Avery had believed exposure of secrecy would dismantle the system, but the system had legalized itself. If presented publicly, Hale could frame the documents as lawful covenant expansion. He could argue necessity. He could claim parental acquiescence under revised doctrine. The network had anticipated scrutiny and fortified against it. Moral ambiguity. For the first time, Avery glimpsed the terrifying plausibility of Hale's argument. Land in Massachusetts was tightening. Younger sons inherited little. Labor markets fluctuated. The Caribbean offered opportunity. Brutal, yes, but economically viable. Forced apprenticeship, inherently different from binding a child to a blacksmith for 7 years. The scale, the distance, the mortality. These differences mattered, but Hale's logic blurred them intentionally. And that blur made resistance harder, because tyranny disguised as policy invites debate, not rebellion. Avery felt the courtroom silence inside his own chest. If he accused Hale publicly, the magistrate would produce this covenant amendment. He would present it as communal decision. He would depict Avery as agitator allied with revivalist chaos. And perhaps some townspeople would accept that narrative, because stability seduces. The emotional undercurrent, "You lost a daughter," Hallie said suddenly. The words were not mocking, they were clinical. "I acknowledge your grief." Avery's jaw tightened. "But grief does not grant governance," Hale continued. "Personal loss cannot dictate public direction. My daughter was not policy. No, she was participant in providence." The phrase struck like a slap without contact. For a heartbeat, Avery nearly lunged, but he did not, because losing control would validate Hale's portrayal. Instead, he asked quietly, "Do you have children, magistrate?" Hale hesitated, the first fracture in composure. "A son, in Salem. Would you redirect him to Barbados?" The fog thickened between them. Hale's silence lingered longer this time. Circumstance determines necessity. It was not an answer, but it was revealing, because even Hale's conviction had boundary, and that boundary was personal. Shift. Avery folded the amended covenant slowly, did not hand it back. "You've shown me something valuable," he said. Hale's brow lifted slightly. "You believe law protects you," Avery continued. "But law written in secrecy fractures trust. Trust is maintained by results," Hale replied. "Then we shall see whose results endure." The boldness surprised even Avery, because in that moment he understood something Hale had overlooked. While the Covenant Amendment provided legal cover within Ipswich, it had not been ratified provincially. It existed as local adaptation. If exposed beyond parish boundaries, to rival ministers, to revivalist factions, to imperial overseers wary of scandal, the amendment could ignite controversy Hale did not control. Hale assumed narrative dominance, but narrative shifts when audience changes. The interval ended. The decision footsteps approached from inside the meetinghouse. Voices murmured. Haley glanced toward the door. "This conversation concludes," he said. "For you," Avery replied. Haley stepped back into fog, composure restored. "You will find resistance costly," he said evenly. "I already have." They held eye contact one final second, not as enemies shouting across battlefield, but as two men representing opposing futures. Hale turned first, disappearing into mist toward waiting horse and wagon. Avery remained, listening, measuring, understanding. He no longer sought to expose a secret crime. He sought to expose a sanctioned doctrine. That required strategy beyond solitary accusation. As lantern light flickered through the meetinghouse door, illuminating crates of blank contracts waiting for children's names, Avery made a decision that would redefine the struggle. He would not confront Hale in private again. He would take the Covenant Amendment, the legal heart of the machinery, beyond Ipswich, to Boston, to rival pulpits. Two audiences Hale could not easily silence. He would transform local conspiracy into colonial scandal, even if it meant tearing apart the fragile structure he once trusted. Even if it meant risking everything that remained. The interval was over, and the next move would not be whispered in fog. Boston did not whisper the way Ipswich did. It roared. By late August of 1742, the port city was swollen with ships and rumor. Merchants argued on Long Wharf over sugar tariffs and insurance claims. Street preachers denounced complacent clergy. Printers inked pamphlets faster than taverns could circulate them. The air smelled of brine, sweat, and anxiety. Into that noise, Thomas Avery carried a single folded document, the amended covenant. He understood now that truth alone did not ignite change. Audience did. And Boston had the largest audience in the province of Massachusetts Bay. Caleb Fitch arranged the first introduction quietly. Not to magistrates, not to merchants, but to a printer. In colonial America, printing presses were dangerous instruments. Pamphlets could fracture reputations overnight. Ministers defended pulpits, but printers shaped public discourse. The print shop on Queen Street was narrow, crowded with paper stacks and metal type. Ink stained everything permanently: hands, aprons, conscience. The printer, Josiah Drake, listened without interruption as Avery explained the Covenant Amendment, the Ipswich disappearance, the Barbados plantation inventory. Drake did not gasp. He calculated names. He asked, Whitford Hale to selectman. Proof. Avery placed the covenant on the table. Drake studied the signatures. His expression shifted not to outrage, but to recognition. Hale's name sells papers, he murmured. Then sell truth with it, Avery replied. Drake hesitated. Printing accusations against a magistrate carried risk. Libel laws were flexible when authority felt threatened, but scandal also sold. Within 3 days, Boston awoke to a pamphlet titled, A Covenant Extended, or A Covenant Corrupted. It did not name Hale directly. It quoted the amendment clause. It asked whether ecclesiastical sanction justified exporting youth for imperial profit. It referenced Ipswich without stating details. It asked questions instead of issuing accusations. Questions are harder to prosecute than claims. By afternoon, copies circulated in taverns, markets, and outside meetinghouses. By evening, Hale knew. The first ripple struck Rowley. Reverend Briggs received letters from parishioners demanding clarification about apprenticeship opportunities. Parents who had felt quiet pressure now felt emboldened. They asked whether their children's futures were being negotiated without consent. Briggs faltered. His loyalty to Hale strained under public scrutiny, because scrutiny introduces fear not just of exposure, but of losing trust. Trust, once cracked, is rarely restored intact. In Ipswich, the reaction was sharper. Those who had supported Avery privately now found validation. Whispers grew louder. Mothers who once accepted divine mystery now demanded explanation. At Sunday service, a congregant interrupted the sermon. Reverend, he called out, does our covenant permit sending children away for sugar? The room froze. Such interruption violated decorum, the minister stammered. Doctrine collided with reality. The meetinghouse no longer felt like sanctuary. It felt like courtroom. Hale responded swiftly. A public council was convened in Boston under the guise of addressing misinterpretations, threatening provincial unity. Merchants, ministers, magistrates gathered in the old State House. The chamber's architecture, high ceilings, wooden gallery, narrow windows, amplified tension. Benches filled with observers, including Avery and Fitch seated near the back. Hull entered without visible agitation. He addressed the council calmly. A pamphlet circulates casting doubt upon lawful adaptations of parish covenant, he began. It insinuates impropriety where there is only prudence. He framed the amendment as humanitarian. Children of limited prospects may be apprenticed within His Majesty's dominion to secure both livelihood and moral instruction. He avoided Barbados by name. He avoided Ipswich by detail. Invoked war with Spain, economic necessity, colonial fragility. He concluded with a warning. Division weakens us at a time when unity preserves us. Applause followed, not thunderous, but sufficient, because fear of instability persuades many. Then Avery stood. He had not been invited to speak. But silence would cement Hale's narrative. I am Thomas Avery of Ipswich, he said clearly. Murmurs rippled. Hale's eyes met his without surprise. My daughter was among 50 children who did not return from Sunday instruction last February. The chamber shifted. 50, a number now spoken publicly. I have plantation inventories from Bridgetown listing juvenile servants matching that number, Avery continued. I have letters beneath our pulpit coordinating shipment. Gasps now. Fitch felt sweat bead at his collar. This was no longer insinuation. This was accusation. Hale's expression remained composed. "Master Avery," he replied evenly, "grief compels imagination." Avery unfolded the Covenant Amendment and held it high. "Is this imagination?" The room leaned forward. Hull did not deny the signature. Instead, he shifted strategy. "Yes," he said calmly. The covenant was amended to permit apprenticeship beyond parish bounds. Lawfully, with consent. Whose consent? Avery demanded. "Parental produce it." Silence stretched. Hale gestured to a clerk who approached carrying a ledger. Inside were contracts bearing parental marks, X's beside names. Avery stared. Many names belonged to families in Ipswich. Families he knew. He felt the floor tilt, because he had believed the children were taken without permission. But here, on parchment, were marks. Consent, or something resembling it. The revelation rippled like shock through the chamber. Had desperate parents signed under pressure? Had they been promised wages, salvation, food security? Hale capitalized immediately. Apprenticeships were presented openly, he declared. Families of limited means chose opportunity. The narrative shifted from abduction to agreement, from conspiracy to contract. Avery's certainty fractured. He remembered the winter before February, poor harvest, rising debt, rumors of economic strain. Had some parents signed willingly? If so, had he misjudged everything? The emotional consequence struck harder than any legal rebuttal, because betrayal from authority wounds, but complicity from neighbors devastates. Yet something felt wrong. Avery requested to examine the ledger. Hale hesitated only a second before nodding. Confidence radiated from him. As Avery scanned signatures, a pattern emerged. Many X's appeared in identical ink density, identical pressure, identical stroke. Not the varied tremor of different hands. The marks were uniform, copied, simulated. Avery looked up slowly. "Who witnessed these marks?" he asked. "Parish elders," Hale replied. "Were parents present simultaneously?" "Yes." "Then why do all signatures bear the same ink?" The chamber quieted further. Avery pressed on. "Why do the strokes lean identically to the right? Why does the ink blot at the same corner?" The clerk shifted uncomfortably. Hale's composure tightened just slightly. Avery held up 2 pages side by side, because they were written by one hand. Murmurs swelled. This was no longer philosophical debate. It was potential forgery. The council erupted into divided voices. Some demanded immediate investigation. Others insisted on decorum. Hale raised his hand for silence. "Allegations require evidence," he said firmly. "Master Avery is no handwriting expert." True, but doubt had entered the room, and doubt is contagious. Outside, Boston streets buzzed with news of the confrontation. Taverns filled, pamphlets doubled in circulation. Revivalist ministers seized upon the controversy, preaching against wolves in magistrates' robes. Established clergy defended covenant authority. The ripple widened beyond Ipswich, beyond Rowley. Parents in Salem and Newburyport began questioning apprenticeship offers. Merchants worried about shipping disruptions. Insurance rates fluctuated. The controversy touched economy, faith, and law simultaneously. It was bigger than one man's grief now. It was colonial identity under strain. The council adjourned without verdict. An investigative committee was proposed. Slow, procedural, manageable. Hay left the chamber surrounded by allies, but not untouched. For the first time, his authority had been publicly challenged with tangible irregularity. Avery stepped into Boston's late afternoon light, uncertain whether he had advanced or endangered everything. Fitch approached him quietly. "You shifted the ground," he whispered. "Or destabilized it," Avery replied. That night, a new pamphlet appeared, unsigned, anonymous. It accused Avery of falsifying evidence in coordination with revivalist agitators funded by rival merchants. The attack was swift and strategic. Public sympathy wavered. Confusion multiplied. Truth drowned in competing narratives. The addictive pull of scandal replaced clarity. Who was right? Who manipulated whom? Each new claim demanded response, and every response deepened division. Back in Ipswich, Miriam faced consequences firsthand. Neighbors avoided her entirely now. Children were forbidden from visiting. A stone struck their cottage window at dusk. Attached was a note. Your husband threatens us all. Fear had shifted direction. Not toward Hale, toward Avery. Because instability frightens more than hidden wrongdoing. 3 nights after the council, Fitch arrived at Avery's Boston lodging pale and breathless. They arrested Drake, he said, the printer, charged with seditious libel. Avery felt the implications immediately. The machinery was reasserting control, not through open force. Through legal intimidation. They silenced the press, Fitch continued. The narrative returns to Hale. And if they silence us? Avery asked quietly. Fitch did not answer. Instead, he handed Avery a final document. It was not from Boston. It was from Barbados. It's intercepted through merchant correspondence. A plantation overseer's report noting juvenile mortality exceeding acceptable ratio. Shipment from Northern Parish deemed less resilient than anticipated. Less resilient. Children reduced to performance metrics. Avery's hands trembled, because this report predated the Covenant Amendment, meaning Ipswich had not been the first trial, just the first documented crack. The conspiracy stretched backward further than he imagined, likely forward. Before Avery could speak, Canuck struck the door downstairs. Heavy, official. Fitch's eyes widened. Constables, the consequences had arrived sooner than expected. Avery folded the plantation report slowly. This was the shocking turning point. Not exposure, not victory, but escalation. Because now the machinery no longer relied solely on persuasion or forged consent. It was moving to remove opposition directly. His footsteps climbed the stairs and fists pounded against the lodging door. Avery realized the battle had shifted from public debate to survival. And somewhere across the Atlantic, children from Ipswich labored beneath Caribbean sun, unaware that their fate had ignited a colonial reckoning. The door latch began to lift, and everything was about to change. The foundation beneath the foundation, the constables did not break the door. They knocked with the authority of men who expected compliance. Thomas Avery stood in the dim Boston lodging room. The Barbados report folded inside his coat. Caleb Fitch pale beside him. Outside, boots shifted on wooden steps. The rhythm was deliberate, not chaotic, not rushed. This was not a mob, it was procedure. Avery opened the door. 2 constables entered, followed by a clerk bearing parchment sealed with provincial insignia. The warrant cited suspicion of seditious libel, unlawful acquisition of private documents, incitement of unrest, threatening the stability of the province of Massachusetts Bay. Hales, language, measured, institutional. You are to present yourself before the council at first light, the clerk announced. No chains, no immediate arrest. But the implication was clear. This would not be a quiet reprimand like Ipswich. This would be exemplary. Avery nodded. The constables withdrew, leaving tension in their wake. Fitch exhaled only after the footsteps faded. They intend to bury you legally, he whispered. Then we make burial public, Avery replied. He removed the plantation report from his coat and placed it on the table beside the Covenant Amendment. Side by side, they formed a bridge between theory and consequence. One sanctioned doctrine, one recorded mortality. Together they were no longer speculation. They were indictment. The confrontation the council chamber filled before sunrise. Word had spread quickly that Avery would face formal charges. Merchants gathered in polished coats, ministers in black robes. Apprentices and dock workers crowded the gallery. Revivalist sympathizers mingled with traditional congregational elders. This was no longer Ipswich. Ast! This was Boston's heart of provincial authority. Magistrate Jonathan Hale sat near the front, composed, hands folded atop the table. His presence radiated quiet command. He had expected escalation. He had prepared for it. The presiding judge read the charges against Avery in a steady voice. Disruption of civic harmony. House. Dissemination of falsehoods. Threat to ecclesiastical authority. Avery listened without interruption. When asked to respond, he did not argue immediately. Instead, he requested permission to submit additional evidence. Hale's jaw tightened subtly. Permission was granted. Avery unfolded the Barbados overseer's report. He read aloud. Juvenile mortality exceeding acceptable ratio. Shipment from Northern Parish deemed less resilient than anticipated. The chamber shifted uneasily. These are not opportunities, Avery said calmly. They are inventories of children. He then displayed the covenant amendment bearing Hale's signature. This amendment enabled such shipments under ecclesiastical sanction. Hale rose. Speculation, he countered. You presume linkage? Avery's voice did not rise. The report predates Ipswich's amendment by months. Which parish preceded us, magistrate? Silence rippled outward. The question altered the narrative. This was no longer a single event. It was a pattern. Hal hesitated, the smallest fracture in composure. Because he knew what Avery implied. If another parish had participated earlier, then documentation existed somewhere. Hidden, concealed. Perhaps beneath another pulpit. Perhaps beneath another floorboard. The judge requested examination of both documents by appointed clerks. Ink was studied, handwriting compared. The forged parental signatures resurfaced under scrutiny. Uniform strokes, identical ink density. Witness statements from Ipswich families began emerging as word reached Boston, some admitting they had never signed anything at all. The ripple became a tide. The antagonist unmasked Hale stood once more. For the first time, his voice sharpened. You mistake governance for villainy, he declared. Our colony teeters between revivalist chaos and imperial expectation. Labor shortages threaten survival. War drains resources. Apprenticeship beyond parish borders is adaptation. Without consent? Avery asked quietly. Consent can be guided, Hale replied. There it was again. Philosophy laid bare. Ends before means. Order before individual. Faith as instrument of control. Hale believed himself righteous. That belief had insulated him from guilt. Until now. Because righteousness fractures when exposed to consequence. The Barbados report circulated among council members. Mortality percentages whispered from one to another. Numbers are difficult to spiritualize when they represent children. The presiding judge leaned forward. Did you authorize shipments beyond Ipswich? Hale paused. Not long, but long enough. Yes, he answered. Under covenant authority, the admission shifted the chamber's weight entirely. No longer speculation. No longer insinuation. Admission. Gasps broke decorum. Ministers who had defended Hale moments earlier stared at the table. Merchants calculated risk. 'Cause scandal threatened trade as surely as rebellion. If Britain perceived internal corruption tied to imperial labor systems, oversight could tighten. Licenses could be revoked. Hale's network had relied on quiet expansion. Public exposure endangered everyone connected. The verdict, the council recessed for deliberation. Hours passed. Boston's streets buzzed. Taverns overflowed with argument. Revivalist ministers preached impromptu sermons about wolves in shepherd's clothing. Traditional clergy insisted on patience and legal clarity. Fitch stood beside Avery outside the chamber. You forced their hand, he said. Forced them to choose between truth and reputation, Avery replied. When the council reconvened, the presiding judge's voice carried weight heavier than morning fog. Magistrate Jonathan Hale was suspended from provincial authority, pending full investigation. The apprenticeship covenant amendments across implicated parishes were declared invalid until reviewed by the General Court. Further, an inquiry would be dispatched to Barbados to examine plantation conditions and mortality claims. It was not imprisonment. Not yet. But it was fracture. The machinery had cracked. Hale's expression remained composed as the announcement concluded, but something in his posture shifted. For the first time, he looked not at Avery, but at the floor. The foundation beneath him had loosened. The cost victory did not feel triumphant. In Ipswich, neighbors divided sharply. Some praised Avery, others blamed him for destabilizing the parish. Trade slowed temporarily as merchants recalibrated alliances. Reverend Briggs and Rowley resigned quietly, citing health. Whitford's Connecticut appointment dissolved under pressure of inquiry. Captain Morton's ship was seized pending investigation into transport practices. Yet not all consequences were visible. Miriam endured months of whispered judgment. Fitch's position at customs evaporated, though he avoided prosecution. Avery returned to Ipswich, not as pariah, but not as hero either. He returned as a reminder that faith could be weaponized, reminder that silence sustains power, reminder that even covenant language can conceal commerce. The long shadow. The Barbados inquiry confirmed juvenile labor shipments from multiple northern parishes. Mortality records were incomplete, fragmented by fire and clerical loss. No comprehensive list of names survived. 50 from Ipswich, perhaps more from elsewhere. The General Court issued new regulations, tightening apprenticeship oversight and requiring provincial review for intercolonial contracts involving minors. The reforms were modest, incremental, but they marked precedent. Clergy could no longer amend covenants unilaterally for imperial labor schemes. Magistrates could not conceal economic ventures beneath spiritual language without scrutiny. Did not end exploitation. History rarely offers such clean conclusions, but it forced transparency, and transparency alters trajectories. The unresolved mystery years later, when renovation crews lifted floorboards at the Old South Meetinghouse in Ipswich to repair structural rot, they discovered an empty cavity beneath the pulpit. No letters remained, no contracts, no additional records. Only faint indentations where documents once lay. Had someone removed evidence before investigation reached that depth? Had Hale secured certain papers before his suspension? Or had another hand intervened? Someone never named in council proceedings? The earlier parish referenced in the Barbados report was never conclusively identified. Records from a coastal town north of Salem were destroyed in a warehouse fire months after inquiry began. Coincidence or precaution? The mystery lingered, not of whether children were taken, but of how far the network extended beyond what was revealed. Some foundations are deeper than a single excavation can reach. Reflection faith in colonial America was architecture. It built communities, structured morality, provided meaning. But architecture, when merged with unchecked authority and economic incentive, can conceal as effectively as it shelters. Hale believed he protected order. Odd Bilford believed he preserved doctrine. Merchants believed they sustained empire, justified action through necessity. Each blurred lines between stewardship and exploitation. Accountability emerged not because institutions corrected themselves, but because one grieving father refused silence. Thomas Avery did not dismantle empire. He did not rescue his daughter from Caribbean soil. He did not end labor exploitation, but he forced a question into public air, and once breathed, certain questions cannot be unasked. Years later, Avery would stand alone inside the meetinghouse, sunlight filtering through narrow windows, illuminating dust motes suspended in stillness. He would rest his hand on the pulpit, on the boards once lifted, on the space where letters had hidden. He would wonder which truths remained beneath, because exposure is rarely total. Power adapts, systems evolve, foundations shift, but they do not disappear. History records outcomes. It rarely records motives fully. And beneath every sanctioned reform lies the possibility that something else was buried quietly, waiting for a future hand to pry it loose. The bell that once rang for counting children now rang for ordinary worship again. Life resumed its rhythm. Trade flowed. Sermons softened. But memory persisted like a faint echo beneath timber beams. The 50 children who never came home did not return. Their names faded from ledgers. Their voices dissolved into wind-crossing Atlantic water. Yet their absence reshaped covenant language. Their disappearance altered provincial law. Their silence forced speech. And somewhere beneath the foundations of faith and governance, something remained unsettled, not fully uncovered, not entirely erased. A cavity where truth once rested, space history never fully filled. The meetinghouse still stands in altered form. The harbor still smells of salt and sugar. The question lingers, as it always does when power cloaks itself in righteousness. What do you believe was truly buried beneath those foundations?